Stop. Right now. Whatever you were doing before you clicked on this video. Put it down. Because I am about to tell you something about the Oregon Trail that your school textbooks left out completely. Something that pioneer journals recorded and then crossed out. Something that wagon train leaders documented and then sealed. Something that the survivors of the most celebrated migration in American history carried with them to their graves and never, not once, not in a single deathbed confession, not in a single private letter, fully explained. Children vanished on the Oregon Trail, not from disease, not from accident, not from the ordinary brutal reality of a 2,000-mile overland journey through some of the most unforgiving terrain in North America. Vanished. There one moment, gone the next. No body, no grave, no explanation that any rational framework could hold. Here are the numbers they never taught you. Between 1843 and 1869, the peak years of Oregon Trail migration, official wagon train records document 117 cases of children listed as simply missing. Not dead, not buried on the trail the way so many were buried, with a marked grave and a carved name and a date and a cause of death. Missing, with one word beside their names in the official records. Lost, not lost the way you lose a hat on a windy day. Lost the way something disappears without explanation from open terrain in daylight in the company of dozens of witnesses who, in every surviving account, reported seeing nothing, hearing nothing, finding nothing. 117 children. Gone. Now, before we go any further, if you are new to this channel, welcome. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you are watching from. I want to know who is out there with this story tonight because the comments on these videos reach more people than you realize. And this story has been buried long enough. The Oregon Trail is 2,000 miles of documented American history. Museums, interpretive centers, national historic markers, every few miles telling you about courage and hardship and the triumph of westward expansion. Not one of those markers mentions the 117 children. Not one. They were crossed out of the journals, sealed from the records, left out of the national narrative as deliberately and as completely as if they had never existed. But they existed. They had names. They had parents who watched them disappear and wrote about it. And then, for reasons that this investigation is going to make very clear, crossed out what they wrote. In the next section, we go into those journals. We look at what the infrared imaging technology found beneath the crossed-out passages in 2003, and we find out what the pioneers saw at the disappearance locations that was so far outside the boundaries of rational explanation that generations of survivors chose silence over disclosure. Every single one of them. Stay with me. Okay, so now you have the number. 117 children. Missing. Not dead. Not buried. Just gone from the official record with one word beside their names and no explanation attached to that word that any rational mind can comfortably hold. But here is where this investigation goes from disturbing to something that I personally find, and I have spent a significant amount of time with this material, genuinely, specifically, historically inexplicable. The journals. Because the Oregon Trail generated an extraordinary volume of written documentation. Pioneers kept diaries, personal journals, letters to family back east sent from frontier post offices along the route. Official wagon train logs maintained by the elected captains who led each party. Published accounts that survivors produced in the years after their arrival. Some immediately, some decades later, some on literal deathbeds when the pressure to maintain a particular version of the story had finally been released by the approach of death. This documentation is vast. It is also in specific, consistent, identifiable ways, full of holes. Researchers examining the original physical documents, not transcriptions, not published versions, but the actual handwritten originals held in Oregon and Missouri and federal archives, have identified a pattern, crossed out passages, not casual, not a writer changing a word or correcting a spelling, deliberate, thorough, complete obliteration of specific sections, so heavily crossed out in many cases that the original text is unrecoverable by the naked eye, and the pattern is specific. These crossed-out passages appear across journals from multiple wagon trains, across multiple years of trail migration, at predictable points in the narrative, after river crossings, after certain mountain passes, after nights camped at specific locations along the route. The same locations, different years, different wagon trains, different riders who never knew each other. The same passages crossed out. Now tell me where you are watching from right now. Drop a comment. Because we are at the point in this story where the pattern starts becoming impossible to explain away, and I want to know who is out there when that happens. Comment your location. This video reaches more people every time you do. In 2003, a team of archivists applied infrared imaging technology to a collection of original Oregon Trail journals held at the Oregon Historical Society. Infrared imaging allows researchers to read text beneath the heaviest crossing out with a clarity that the naked eye cannot achieve. It is the same technology used to recover lost text from damaged historical manuscripts. It is precise. It is reliable. It does not interpret. It simply reveals what was written. They applied it to 4 separate journals from 4 separate wagon trains across 3 separate decades. And beneath the crossed-out passages, in all 4 journals, at the same trail locations, in the writing of 4 people who had no connection to each other, they found descriptions, not accounts of violence, not records of shameful decisions made under survival pressure that the writers later regretted, not the kind of content you would expect from people trying to conceal something that reflected badly on themselves. Descriptions of something at specific locations along the trail, something the pioneers saw at the locations where the children disappeared, something that was present at those locations when the children were gone, something that, in all 4 accounts, written by 4 different people in 4 different decades, was described with enough consistency that the archivist team lead wrote in her project notes, in the careful, understated language of a professional trying to stay on the right side of her own credibility. The consistency of description across these 4 independent accounts is not explainable by coincidence or by the influence of shared cultural narrative. These 4 people describe the same thing. They crossed it out for the same reason. And the reason, based on everything else in these journals, was not shame. Not shame. Something else. Something that 4 different witnesses chose to obliterate from the historical record, not because it reflected badly on them, but because they understood clearly, immediately, without needing to discuss it with each other across decades of trail migration, that something should not be in the record. In the next section, we map the disappearances. We plot 117 missing children against the trail geography. And we find 7 locations that appear in every account that the Native communities have been naming for generations before the first wagon train arrived, and whose names, in every language, across every culture, translate into English as the same terrifying thing. Stay with me. Okay, this is the section where the pattern becomes undeniable. And I want to be honest with you about something before we go into it, because there is a version of this investigation that stops at the crossed-out journals, that says, interesting, disturbing, historically significant, but ultimately explainable by the ordinary human impulse to conceal things that are shameful or frightening or too strange for public record. That version of this investigation is comfortable. It is also incomplete, because when you take the 117 missing children and you plot their last known locations against the trail geography, when you do the actual work of mapping disappearance against terrain, what you find is not the random distribution of loss that the ordinary hazards of trail migration would produce. What you find is a pattern so specific and so consistent that it has no comfortable explanation. The disappearances cluster. 7 locations. 7 specific points along the 2,000-mile Oregon Trail, at which the disappearance rate was dramatically, statistically impossibly, higher than the surrounding terrain. Points at which wagon trains from different years, different starting points, different compositions, all lost children, consistently, repeatedly, across 26 years, not spread evenly across 2,000 miles of trail, not distributed the way disease deaths distributed, not random. 7 points, the same 7 points, every time. Now here is where I need you to really pay attention, because this is the detail that took this investigation from a historical mystery into something that I genuinely do not have a comfortable category for. The Native communities whose ancestral territory the Oregon Trail crossed, communities that the pioneers encounter across the length of the trail, those communities had names for these 7 locations, old names, names that predated the first wagon train by generations, names that have been passed down through oral tradition across centuries of people living on and moving through that terrain. And when researchers translated those names, when they took the native language names for all 7 of the disappearance locations and rendered them into English, every single one of them meant the same thing. Different languages, different cultures, different communities with no contact with each other across the geography of the trail. Same meaning, the place where children do not return from. 7 locations, 7 names, 1 concept. The people who had been living on that land for thousands of years before the first wagon train arrived already knew. They had been warning each other about these 7 specific places, for children specifically, not for adults, not for travelers generally, but for children, for generations before a single pioneer family loaded a wagon in Independence, Missouri, and pointed it west. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you are watching from, because we just hit the moment in this story where rational explanation starts running out, and I want to know who is out there when that happens. Comment, engage. This story reaches more people every time you do. And here is the final layer of this section that I want you to carry into everything that follows. The Oregon Trail was not routed by accident. It was surveyed, mapped, deliberated over by people who consulted with native guides and native communities about the terrain, who asked about the geography, who gathered information about which routes were passable and which were dangerous. They were told about the 7 locations. The record shows this. In at least 3 documented cases, 3 separate accounts of trail surveyors consulting with native guides about specific sections of the route. The guides identified the disappearance locations specifically, warned against them specifically, described what those locations did to children specifically. The surveyors noted the warnings and built the trail through all 7 locations anyway, because the alternative routes were longer, more difficult, more expensive to grade and maintain. 7 warnings from people who have been watching those locations for 1,000 years. 7 warnings noted and ignored. And 117 children paid for that decision with whatever happened to them at those 7 points in the trail geography that every culture that had ever lived near them already knew by the same name, the place where children do not return from. In the next section, we read Margaret Hartley's journal, the one account that was not crossed out, the 3 pages that describe what was at the rock formations in the dark, and the arrangement that one woman made to bring her own children back, while 3 others did not come back with them. Stay with me, Margaret Hartley. Remember that name, because in an investigation full of crossed-out passages and sealed records and deliberate silences maintained across generations, Margaret Hartley is the one person who did not cross it out, did not seal it, did not choose the comfortable silence that every other witness to what happened at those 7 trail locations chose. She wrote it down, clearly, completely, in plain, direct language with no dramatization, and no attempt to make it sound like anything other than exactly what she witnessed. And then she left it there, for anyone who found it to read. A wagon train of 42 people departing Independence, Missouri. Margaret Hartley traveling with her husband and her 3 children. A journal kept from the first day to the last, detailed, practical, the writing of a woman who recorded what she observed with a specific, unsentimental clarity of someone who has spent her life making accurate assessments of difficult situations and acting on those assessments without flinching. The journal survived 52 years of Margaret Hartley's life in the Willamette Valley. Her death in 1903, transferred to her eldest daughter, private family possession until 1978. Donation to the Oregon Historical Society, cataloging, archiving, and then 16 years sitting largely unexamined among thousands of other pioneer documents until a graduate student in 1994 read it cover to cover and found page 47, Southern Idaho, a location Margaret Hartley calls the Hollow Ground, a shallow depression in the terrain surrounded by rock formations. The wagon train stopped for the night. After dark, the children of the wagon train began moving toward the rock formations, not running, not playing, walking, slowly, together, with the specific quality of movement that Margaret Hartley described. And this is her exact language, as children following something that the adults standing 20 feet away could not see. She went after them. She reached the rock formations. She found her 3 children there. And she found what was already there, waiting. Now stop right here. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from, because we are at the moment in this story, the moment Margaret Hartley walked into those rock formations in the dark, that everything changes. Drop your location. Drop a comment. Because this video reaches more people every time you engage with it, and this story has been sitting in an Oregon archive for 30 years waiting for the audience it deserves. The account runs for 3 pages. 3 pages of Margaret Hartley's plain, direct handwriting, describing what she found at the rock formations on a night in southern Idaho in 1851. I am not going to reproduce all of it here, not because I am protecting you from it. You are adults and you can handle difficult information, but because the full 3 pages contain a description that sits at the absolute boundary of what language can do with certain categories of experience. Margaret Hartley was a precise writer. She used precise words, and the precision of her description is, in ways that I find genuinely difficult to process even after reading it multiple times, more disturbing than any vague atmospheric account would be. What I will tell you is what the 3 pages establish. Something was at those rock formations before the children arrived. It had been there before, at that location specifically. The language Margaret Hartley uses makes clear that what she encountered at the hollow ground was not surprised by her arrival, was not threatened by it, was not changed in any way by the presence of an adult who had followed the children. It simply continued doing what it was doing while she watched. And while she watched, 3 children from the wagon train were taken in a manner that Margaret Hartley described, and that I am going to leave in her words rather than paraphrase. They went without sound and without distress, and that was the worst part of it. Children taken by violence cry out. These did not. They simply became somewhere else. Somewhere else. Not gone. Somewhere else. And then Margaret Hartley wrote the sentence that the graduate student who found this journal has described as a sentence she thinks about every day. I made an arrangement. I did not intend to record its terms. The Lord will judge me for it, and that judgment will be more fair than any I would receive from the people of this train. An arrangement. Her 3 children came back. 3 others did not. She never explained why. She never explained what the terms were. She lived for 52 more years with whatever she agreed to on that night in southern Idaho, and she took the terms of that arrangement to her grave in 1903. In the final section, we find out what the 7 locations look like today, what the 2016 Wildlife Survey found, and why, 170 years after the last wagon train rolled through those 7 points in the trail geography, something about those locations has not changed. Stay with me. The Oregon Trail is a National Historic Trail, administered by the National Park Service, documented, marked, celebrated across 2,000 miles of American landscape as one of the defining experiences of westward expansion. There are museums dedicated to it, interpretive centers, carefully maintained historical markers at significant points along the route telling the story of pioneer courage and sacrifice and the triumph of arrival. Not one of those markers mentions 117 missing children. Not one. The 7 locations are marked. Several of them are significant enough in the trail's physical geography that they appear prominently in the official historical record. Courthouse Rock, the Platte River crossings, the Blue Mountain passes, all documented, all marked, all presented to millions of people who visit the Oregon Trail corridor every year as significant points in the pioneer story. The disappearances at those locations are not mentioned, not in small print, not in a footnote, not in a single interpretive panel anywhere along 2,000 miles of federally administered historic trail, crossed out of the journals, sealed from the records, left out of the national narrative, as completely and as deliberately as if 117 children had never existed. But the locations exist. Right now, tonight, while you are sitting wherever you are sitting watching this video, those 7 points in the Oregon Trail geography exist exactly as they existed when the first wagon trains rolled through them in 1843. The terrain has not changed significantly. The rock formations that Margaret Hartley described at the hollow ground are still there. The shallow depression in the southern Idaho landscape that she called the hollow ground is still there. And the other 6 locations, the quiet bend of Platte, the unnamed Blue Mountain Pass, the 4 others that appear in the pioneer records and in the native oral traditions and in the crossed-out passages of journals that infrared imaging recovered in 2003, all still there, unchanged, unmarked, unacknowledged. Now drop a comment right now and tell me where you are watching from, because we are at the final piece of this story, and I genuinely want to know who is out there when it lands. Comment your location, because this video reaches more people every time you engage with it, and what I am about to tell you deserves the largest possible audience. The National Park Service conducted a routine wildlife survey of the Oregon Trail Corridor. Standard procedure. Biologists moving through the trail, geography documenting animal populations, species distribution, population density, reproductive health indicators. At 5 of the 7 disappearance locations, 5 of the 7, the survey team documented the same anomaly. No juvenile animals, not reduced numbers, not fewer than expected, none, 0, at 5 specific points along the Oregon Trail Corridor, in terrain that otherwise showed completely normal wildlife population distribution, including completely normal juvenile population numbers. There were no young animals of any species whatsoever. The survey team noted it, filed it in their report as an anomalous finding requiring further study, and moved on. Nobody in 2016 connected that finding to the 117 missing children. Nobody connected it to the crossed-out journal passages. Nobody connected it to Margaret Hartley's arrangement and the terms she refused to record. Nobody connected it to the native oral traditions that have been naming those 7 locations by the same name for 1,000 years before the first wagon train arrived. The place where children do not return from. But here is what I cannot stop thinking about. Whatever was at those 7 locations in the 1840s and 1850s and 1860s, whatever Margaret Hartley found at the rock formations on a night in southern Idaho in 1851 and made an arrangement with, whatever the crossed-out passages describe with enough consistency across 4 independent journals that a professional archivist noted it as unexplainable by coincidence, it is still there, still operating at those 7 points in the trail geography, still producing the same anomaly, the absence of young things, that it produced across 26 years of wagon train migration, still unnamed on any official marker, still uncrossed out from the landscape itself, even though it was crossed out of every journal that tried to describe it, still waiting, the way it was waiting when the pioneers built their trail through 7 locations that every culture that had ever lived near them already knew by the same name. And the trail still runs through all 7. 2,000 miles of celebrated American history, with 7 locations inside it that something has been using for longer than American history has existed, for purposes that Margaret Hartley understood well enough to make an arrangement about, and terrible enough that she refused to record the terms. Stay with me. Here is where we end. Not with answers, not with resolution, not with a comfortable closure that we need historical mysteries to produce so we can file them away and move on with the full picture. 117 children, 7 locations, 26 years, crossed-out journals, sealed records, native communities who named those places by the same warning for 1,000 years before the first wagon arrived, Margaret Hartley's arrangement whose terms she carried to her grave, a 2016 wildlife survey that found no juvenile animals at 5 of the 7 locations and filed it as anomalous and moved on, and a National Historic Trail with 2,000 miles of carefully maintained markers that mentions none of it, not one word. The pioneers crossed out what they saw. The institutions built monuments over where it happened. And the 7 locations sit inside the most celebrated migration route in American history, unchanged, unmarked, still producing the same absence they produced in 1843, waiting for the next traveler who gets too close. The trail never closed. It is still open, and the 7 locations are still on it. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Tell me which detail stayed with you. Tell me what you are thinking right now. Subscribe, because next week we go somewhere darker. Stay with me.